32 years under the dictatorship of General Suharto, Jakarta became a city that grew on the basis of economic development, foreign debt, and control over rights and liberties. Even though Suharto was toppled from power by the people in 1998, and Indonesia moved in the new direction of political, economic, and social reform, in Jakarta, one thing did not change, but rather intensified, namely the tears of the poor that came along with evictions. According to the aspirations of the elite classes, Jakarta had to be a city that was modern, beautiful, and attractive to investors. In order for this dream to come true, what was needed was urban development according to a plan that reflected the vision of the business sector. Therefore, the settlements of the poor, slum communities, had to be eliminated, whether through infrastructure development, urban beautification, conservation of public spaces, facilitation of private investment, or accusing the poor of being the cause of disasters in the city, such as flooding. The person expressing this view was Sutioso, the governor of Jakarta from 1997 to 2007. He served as a representative of the ruling class who was sent to wage a war against the poor. Under Sutioso's administration, in the period from 2001 to 2003, 10,321 slum families, or around 50,000 people, were evicted. A 2006 research report by Human Rights Watch that studied evictions carried out between 2001 and 2006 in 14 areas of Jakarta clearly found that human rights violations took place in every case, and that the state both used excessive force as well as failed to prepare alternative arrangements or assistance for the evictees. For Sutioso, the war against the poor was not limited to slum areas, but expanded onto the streets, too. Tricycle drivers, hawkers, street stall operators, street musicians, beggars, and the homeless all became eyesores in Jakarta and made the city of the elite classes less grand, so they became targeted for elimination. Tricycles were seized, and small shops, stalls, and street-side car washes were demolished. In addition, forces were mustered to arrest beggars, commercial sex workers, vagrants, and street musicians. Jakarta had to advance forward to become a regional city. The way of living and the informal occupations of the poor had to be eliminated because they did not create economic value. As Sutioso declared, sidewalk vendors often seize public facilities. Consequently, economic growth will be suspended, affecting national economic growth. Poor in the city were hunted down and persecuted. They had no alternative other than to stand up and fight. There was resistance to evictions in many areas, even though many times the slum dwellers lost and had to retreat from their original settlements. Tricycle drivers couldn't help but wonder why an honest occupation that had existed in Jakarta for such a long time had to be banned, and they had to do something to protect the tools of their trade.
Yang di rumah jam 2 malam, ya namanya disumputin di WC, digaruk. Ya bukannya garong-garong lagi, orang becak digembok.
It was the same for women vendors. They went as far as to strip off their clothes to protest against the unjust authorities who were assaulting the way of life of those who had to work all day just in order to put food on the table at night. In the end, Jakarta was simmering in an atmosphere of class conflict. The anger of the poor was exploding everywhere. Protests were held many times, as were marches, with thousands of households going to Parliament and the office of the President. And then, the big day to demand dignity arrived. On 5 December 2003, the urban poor started a demonstration in front of Jakarta City Hall to demand that Governor Sutioso stop evicting communities and seizing the tools of trade used by the poor, and respect the economic, social, and cultural rights of the people in accordance with the UN-sanctioned Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Even though the motive for the demonstration of power by the poor had its origins in the instinctual grudge borne by those who had been victimized by the state, it is still undeniable that there was organizing done for the struggle to be conducted on the basis of human rights and mobilizations to be carried out under the principles of nonviolence. The organization that fulfilled this duty was the Urban Poor Consortium, or UPC. UPC started with the coming together of social activists who were interested in the problems of urban poverty and evictions and in housing rights. After being established in 1997, UPC committed itself to working with the urban poor and became a part of history in the post-Suharto era, when it joined with the poor to oppose the development path for Jakarta promoted by Sutioso. In terms of strategies used in the struggle, aside from holding demonstrations to pressure state power holders, UPC also devised other activities to help the urban poor, such as setting up a public kitchen to make boxes of food for distribution to those affected by the anti-poor policies, or campaigning at the international level. That the urban poor in Jakarta stood up to fight clearly reflects that the culture of silence that used to guide their lives had been partially destroyed. At the very least, the voice and the power of the exploited had now taken shape, and the response of those at the grassroots didn't just stop there. With the goal of creating a just society and fostering structural change in Indonesia, UPC did not just limit itself to doing concrete work focused on the immediate situation. Instead, other missions that UPC undertook wholeheartedly included joining together with the urban poor to critique the problems of poverty and injustice, campaign and mobilize to raise the awareness of the civil society sector, and demand that the government change its policies to address the problems adequately. In 1998, after the economic crisis, the Indonesian government borrowed money from the World Bank to implement the Social Safety Net program to alleviate the suffering of the people through measures such as providing welfare payments to families that were unable to help themselves and loans to small-scale businesses. But in the opinion of UPC, this was simply a method of using money to keep the people quiet so they would not raise a hullabaloo about their economic hardship. In addition, the Social Safety Net program itself fully lacked transparency and was plagued by corruption. Bias and favoritism were involved. The program lacked the participation of communities, and the poorest of the poor were unable to access the program's budget. Therefore, UPC carried out public advocacy demanding that the government place an importance on solving structural problems at the point of origin, such as lack of access to land, employment, education, and health, rather than merely alleviating people's hardships down the line. UPC's advocacy at the time resulted in the World Bank canceling its loan of $600 million to the Indonesian government in 1999. On 1 October 2001, the United Nations declared on the occasion of World Habitat Day a campaign to demand that all nations solve the problem of housing for the poor by upgrading communities so that they rise out of the condition of being a slum in accordance with the slogan, "Cities Without Slums." But in Indonesia, it seemed as if the slogan was interpreted differently. It is right to have cities without slums, but this must be accomplished through demolition and relocation. This was the view that administrators used to solve the problem of the urban poor in Indonesia. And in the process, the World Bank was pulled into the fray. Basically, the World Bank loaned money to local governments to upgrade the settlements of the poor. But in practice, these loans were used to finance the demolition and relocation of communities. For slum dwellers, settlements in the city are the roots of life. They are deeply connected to their occupation, the education of their children, and their social network. Therefore, no one wants to move out of the city. To enforce the Declaration of the United Nations in practice, on World Habitat Day 2001, UPC and urban poor organizations held the demonstration to pressure the World Bank to stop providing loans to local governments to demolish and relocate communities. More than 1,000 protesters moved into the Jakarta office of the World Bank.
Tuntutan kita kepada Bank Dunia. Yang pertama, kekerasan, pemukulan, penahanan kepada kawan-kawan tukang becak dan kampung-kampung yang digusur.
Let me say a few words about this program which the World Bank and Habitat together created 2 years ago, Cities Without.
A few days after the demonstration, the Indonesian country director of the World Bank visited slum communities in Jakarta to see the condition of problems and open up negotiations with representatives of the urban poor. Even though the program could not be stopped, the World Bank nevertheless agreed to negotiate with the government to have it review its program of evicting communities. For the poor, this was like warning an international institution, "You are the guest and we are the host. Any assistance you provide must meet the genuine needs of the Indonesian people, who are the real owners of this country." The phenomenon of flooding in big cities in all regions of the world has increased. In Jakarta, it is the same. The huge amount of rain that fell continuously in January 2002 resulted in the entire city being covered by standing water. 52 people died from the flooding, and 365,435 people had to evacuate to escape the water, not even to mention the massive economic damage suffered. The governor of Jakarta tried to hide his failure in management by pointing the finger at slum communities instead, accusing them of blocking the waterways and causing the flooding. This unfair accusation led to a reaction by the urban poor. Together with grassroots people, UPC exposed the failures of the Jakarta administration in planning and prevention and coordination with various other cities to facilitate the drainage of water. The flooding was caused by a failure in administration, not the establishment of community settlements, as alleged by the politicians. Therefore, in order to get the state to accept responsibility, urban poor organizations mobilized to press for the payment of compensation to the people for damages and demand that the state accept the participation of the poor in the rehabilitation of communities after the flooding. Furthermore, they also collected signatures to pressure the governor of Jakarta to resign. Being used to exercising authority, when challenged by the poor, the elite classes of Jakarta did not hesitate to use violence.
Anak ini terkejut ketika masa FBR datang ke Komnas HAM. Bahkan ajakan masa UPC untuk berdamai tidak diindahkan.
Even though the demand for rights had to be paid for with losses and injuries, the political action of UPC and the poor must be regarded as a contribution toward building direct democracy in Indonesia. In advocating for human rights, UPC was not working alone, but cooperated with the civil society sector, including lawyers, academics, public intellectuals, and a network of artists. The power of art was used to create a mass mobilization that was refined, lively, and reflected a cultural perspective.
Di sana tempat lahir beta, dibuai dibesarkan bunda, tempat berlindung di hari tua, tempat terakhir menutup mata.
This was the charm of the struggle of the poor in Indonesia. Surabaya is the main city in eastern Java. As the second largest city in Indonesia, even though it plays second fiddle to Jakarta in some ways, Surabaya has all the same features as the capital, including evictions of the poor. In 2002, the mayor of Surabaya carried out the eviction of communities along the Wonokromo River in order to beautify the area. Even though this event caused the destruction of several hundred families, it also prompted the community residents who still remained to understand the importance of forming a group. This was the starting point of Paguyuban Warga Strenkali Surabaya, PWSS, or the Organization of Riverside Communities in Surabaya, which at present has members who are active in 7 communities. PWSS adheres to the principle that if the poor still hold fast to the culture of silence, the only possible outcome is defeat. But if they speak out and demonstrate their power, there might also be the possibility of winning. And why shouldn't the poor also win sometimes? This way of thinking has made PWSS choose to stand up and fight. The big challenge for this group of the urban poor has been to upgrade their community settlements along the river so that they are secure and have a good environment, in order for them to be part of making Surabaya a livable city. Since 2003, with the support of UPC and civil society, such as universities in Surabaya, architects and lawyers, PWSS has undertaken many actions to make the local government accept the existence of communities along the riverside. In line with the slogan, "Relocation No, Renovation Yes," that rejected demolition and resettlement and proposed the alternative of on-site upgrading of communities, PWSS gathered information about the establishment of community settlements, made alternative plans, and also mobilized in a campaign to get the government to accept its proposal. In addition, they also took action to upgrade their settlements and the environment by shifting their houses inward from the riverside by 5 meters in order to clear this space for the development of public infrastructure and beautification by the community. They designed the activity giving back to the river by creating rules prohibiting the throwing of garbage into the river and planting trees and making parks in order to increase the area of green spaces alongside the river. PWSS persuaded the government to see that demolishing and relocating communities creates tremendous loss, while the community upgrading approach is more worthwhile in many respects, such as saving on capital investment as well as socio-economically. This is because people live close to their place of work and hence have economic security. In addition, social relations are not disrupted and broken as they are when communities are demolished and relocated. The efforts of PWSS finally resulted in the provincial legislature of East Java consenting to pass Bylaw 9 in 2007, known as Perda No. 9, 2007, in order to enable communities along the riverside in Surabaya to carry out settlement and environmental upgrading within 5 years, after which an assessment would be conducted to determine whether these communities should be permitted to establish permanent settlements. Perda No. 9, 2007 was the first step towards success for PWSS, since it was a regulation that compelled the local government into opening up the opportunity for the poor to be able to carry out on-site upgrading of their communities. From this point on, other concrete developments followed. The members of PWSS, one by one, implemented upgrading of their communities, including the housing, public infrastructure system, and physical environment with the support of a revolving fund from the Asian Coalition for Community Action, or ACA. Nevertheless, in spite of Perda No. 9, 2007, the mayor of Surabaya still executed the eviction of communities in the Jagir area along the Wonokromo River in May 2009, affecting more than 500 families. Therefore, what PWSS had to do was expedite the upgrading of the settlements and physical environments of the remaining communities in order to prove that the poor can live with dignity in the city in Surabaya. At the same time, they had to strengthen the power of the masses and build a network with other people's organizations. This was because the case of the Jagir evictions in 2009, coming after Perda No. 9, 2007, clearly showed that the state cannot be trusted by the poor, particularly if they have insufficient bargaining power. In the beginning of 2005, while it was preparing to deal with the evictions in Surabaya, UPC had to change its mission suddenly and head for Banda Aceh on the western coast of Sumatra. This was one of the areas affected by the massive tsunami that struck on 26 December 2004. This natural disaster took the lives of around 200,000 Acehnese. For the survivors, however, the bad luck was not over, because the second wave of the tsunami was yet to come. This second wave was not a natural disaster like the first, but nevertheless had a catastrophic impact too. It came in the form of the eviction and relocation of coastal fishing villages. After the tsunami, the Acehnese were relocated to tents and temporary shelters, where the government tried to paint a picture of their future. In their new resettlement areas, which were 40 kilometers away from the coast, the villagers would be safe from tsunamis and would have new houses with complete public infrastructure. But for those born as fisherfolk, the dream of the government spelled their own death. On the contrary, it was the graves of the dead in their native villages that gave hope to the coastal communities because they were close to the sea, the source of livelihood, and the social and cultural life of the communities were entirely rooted there. Therefore, the only way forward was to go back to the past, to go back and find the remains of their original villages and help each other to rebuild and revive their communities once again. This determination was nothing more than an effort to reclaim human dignity. For this reason, UPC did not hesitate to support the struggle of the Achenese fisherfolk to return to their original settlements. UPC's work began with joining together with Uplink, a network of the urban poor in 14 cities in Indonesia, to implement a project to rehabilitate settlements and lives in Aceh. The first phase, donations in cash and kind were gathered. Aside from money, around 50 tons of food, clothes, medicines, and drinking water were delivered by boat to assist the victims. Then they went to become familiar and establish closer relations with the villagers in the refugee centers. There was an alternative health team that treated the ill. They used songs and music to help the victims relax, ease their pain and loss, and give them encouragement. UPC helped establish the organization Udip Beusali, which was a network composed of 23 fishing villages that wanted to return to their original settlements, and assisted them in making community rehabilitation plans. Udip Beusali held talks with the government many times in order to insist on the needs of the villagers. Finally, an important round of talks arrived, only this time the villagers spoke through their actions. On 26 February 2005, villagers in the refugee center gathered their belongings, took down their tents, and headed back to their fishing villages. There, their first priority was to construct temporary housing and build a small mosque for prayer and to serve as a central meeting point. After taking the first step, the second step soon followed. It was an activity to plant mangrove forest as an official declaration by the fishing villages of Aceh that they were taking back the land. They joined together with technical experts to determine anew the position of the villagers' plots of land, because the land ownership documents had disappeared with the waves. When finished, they marched to the land office to demand that the local government accept their map and issue new land title documents to the villagers. After that came the stage of participatory housing design, emphasizing the stability of the foundation in order to withstand earthquakes before joining together in the construction work. 2 years after the tsunami, the fishing communities in Aceh began their new lives. Under the project implemented with the cooperation of UPC, Uplink, and Udip Beusali, 3,350 houses were constructed on the original location. As a result of this cooperation, they received the Dubai International Award for Best Practices to Improve the Living Environment in 2008. This award reflects the power of the poor in rehabilitating their settlements and protecting the cultural ways of their communities. Part of a statement made by UPC opposing evictions reads, "Eviction means giving back the land seized by the poor to the legal owners that often could easily get the certificate of land ownership through bribery." Of course, this phenomenon doesn't only happen in Jakarta. Makassar, a city in southern Sulawesi, is another target where the capitalists are aiming to take land from the poor. Kalawisi community was evicted by a private individual in 2004 after the High Court issued a verdict against the people. 35 families had lived there together for more than 30 years, having purchased the land from the original settlers. But the fact that they had pioneered the land was meaningless in the absence of legal documents that could be submitted to the court. For the poor in Makassar, the nightmare did not end there, since many other communities were forced to follow in the footsteps of Kalawisi. Leping, Pontodoli, Kasikasi, Pontowala, and Bulogading are all poor people's settlements over which private parties are trying to claim ownership. Some of them are now already in court, and if one considers the fate of Kalawisi, it seems that the community's chances of winning in these cases are not very high. Nevertheless, the poor do not live just to surrender. The urban poor organization in Makassar called Komite Perjuangan Rakyat Miskin, or KPRM, mobilized in response to the capitalists' greed. Their strategy was to reach a political agreement with the mayor before the election in 2008, whereby the issue of stopping evictions was one important part of the agreement. After the election, they used the situation in Kampong Pisang community, which was being evicted by a private individual, in order to hold the mayor to this agreement. On 29 August 2010, the mayor of Makassar, along with local government agencies, came to Kampong Pisang to listen to the proposal of the residents. With the technical support of a group of architects, a new community plan was drafted for a space of 7,000 square meters out of the original area of 3.7 hectares. This plan was proposed as a concrete alternative for the mayor to take and negotiate with the private owner in order to share the land with the 33 resident families. As a result, at present, the owner has consented to the principle of land sharing, but there is still no agreement on the size of the land. This is an initial victory for KPRM, but they will have to continue working to make Kampong Pisang into a pilot site in Makassar that uses the approach of community upgrading as an alternative to solving the problem of housing. This is because the poor have come too far to go back to the days of demolition and relocation. Kendari is another city in Sulawesi that has concretely seen the poor engage in settlement upgrading on the original location. Bongkutoko is a community along a bay that has been established for more than 30 years. 55 families have rented land from the private owner and built houses on their own. Their occupation is buying fish from the fish port and taking it to hawk in communities. The residents of Bongkutoko lived like this up until February 2011, when they discovered that the landowner was going to sell the land to an investor to build a container terminal, and the community would have to be demolished and move away. At first, the residents had many different views. Some wanted to find new land elsewhere, while others planned to move into rented rooms. But after receiving advice from Germes, the organization of the poor with which UPC is working, residents of Bongkutoko decided to come together as a group and negotiate with the state. 5 small savings groups were established, and consultations were held on model houses and a community plan on a new plot of land. After that, the target was the mayor's office. The residents of Bongkutoko proposed that the city of Kendari buy a plot of land for the community located not far away from the original location in order to carry out a new settlement project. By mobilizing, campaigning, coordinating, and cooperating with the city of Kendari and the Ministry of Social Affairs, the proposal of the residents was finally accepted. On 10 December 2011, the urban poor of Kendari joined in celebrating International Human Rights Day by launching Bunkutoko Community's settlement project. On the piece of land measuring 1.8268 hectares that the local government purchased and gave to the community, each family will receive a 10 by 15 meter plot, as well as budgetary support for housing construction from the Ministry of Social Affairs amounting to 10 million rupiahs per house. The people have set up a system of financial management themselves. Construction of the new houses of the people of Bunkutoko will be completed in 2012. Therefore, this is another concrete case that UPC hopes will be a model for solving the problem of housing of the urban poor. Lampung is a seaside city in southern Sumatra. But on the beach that stretches 27 kilometers long, the peace and quiet, livelihoods of fisherfolk, and contentment of the communities are disappearing. This is because the local government and foreign capital are pushing for their waterfront city project, which, if implemented, will change the face of Lampung into an economic zone and tourist city. At present, many land development companies are claiming possession rights over land along the coast, which is where the communities are settled. If they are not demolished and removed, it is truly difficult to imagine where the original settlements of the poor could be inserted along the seaside that will be full of commercial centers, business districts, and entertainment areas in the future. Going back to Jakarta, according to the Jakarta Post, the Indonesian government has a plan to demolish and relocate 14,075 families in communities along the Ciliwung River to 29-story flats that are currently being constructed. The original claim is that these communities are in an area that is at risk of flooding and are an obstacle to the dredging of drainage channels. The developments in both Lampung and Jakarta indicate that the problem of land and eviction are still likely to be the #1 enemy of the Indonesian urban poor. The question is, how will the poor deal with the elite classes' program of demolitions and relocations? What will they do to avoid repeating the defeat of slum communities, as happened during the time of Governor Sutioso? How will they revive the power of the urban poor network once again, through expansion of the mass base and building up of alliances to help defend communities against eviction, while also pushing for the replacement of the government's policy of demolition and relocation with the concrete alternatives of the urban poor? The answer to these questions lies in organizing from below, which UPC and the urban poor movement in Indonesia are now doing. We hope that they will be successful in this challenging mission.
Burung malam senandungkan lagu juangmu, ku dengarkan suaramu sang surya. Bukan milik, bukan harta yang kan rusak rena hidupmu. Ketakutan hilang milik, hilang harta. bukan milik, bukan harta yang kan rusak karena hidupmu. Ketakutan hilang milik